I moved into the apartment on a Thursday. I remember because the building super, a heavy-set man named Gerald who smelled of cigarettes and boiled cabbage, told me Thursday was the only day the freight elevator worked properly, and that I should get everything in before nightfall. I didn't ask why. I was 34 years old, newly separated from my wife of 6 years, and I had rented the place sight unseen based on 3 photographs and a monthly rate that was, in retrospect, obscenely low for that part of the city. I told myself I didn't care about the details. I was wrong about that, the way I've been wrong about most things that have mattered. The apartment was on the 7th floor of a building that had once been a textile factory. The ceilings were high, the windows were tall and faced north, and the radiators made a sound at night like something dragging itself across a metal floor. The previous tenant had left behind a wooden chair and a calendar from 4 years ago, still open to November. I threw the calendar away. I kept the chair because I had no others. The first strange thing happened 9 days after I moved in. I woke at 3:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I checked my phone before I sat up to the sound of the front door closing. Not opening, closing, as if someone had already come inside and was now pulling the door shut behind them. I lay still for what felt like a long time. The apartment had one long corridor that connected the bedroom to the front room and the kitchen, and I lay there listening to the silence at the end of it. There was nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement. I got up, turned on every light, and checked every room. The front door was locked from the inside, the chain was on, and there was no one there. I put it down to the building settling, or a dream I had already half forgotten, and I went back to sleep. The second thing happened a week later. I had been working late at my desk, which I had positioned near the north windows, and somewhere around midnight I noticed a smell. It was faint at first, the way distant rain smells before you can hear it, and then it became something else entirely. It was organic and close and wrong. I searched the apartment for a dead animal, for something rotting in a cabinet or beneath the radiator. I found nothing. By morning, the smell was gone, and I was not entirely sure I had not imagined it. I want to be careful here about how I describe what came next, because I am not a person who is given to exaggeration, and I have spent a long time trying to reconstruct these events accurately. I am not interested in making them more than they were. I am interested only in what they were. About 3 weeks into my time there, I began to hear, very occasionally and always between 2 and 4 in the morning, the sound of a child crying somewhere in the building. It was muffled and directionally confusing, the way sounds travel strangely through old structures with thick walls and irregular ventilation, and I initially assumed it was coming from another unit. The building had 12 apartments and several families. I thought nothing of it for the first few nights. What changed my thinking was a conversation I had with my neighbor across the hall, a quiet woman in her 50s named Diane, who had lived in the building for 11 years. I mentioned to her, casually, that I sometimes heard a child at night, and she looked at me with an expression I did not fully understand at the time. She told me there were no children in the building. There hadn't been for years. She said it in a way that ended the conversation, and she went inside. And after that, she never quite met my eyes in the hallway again. I started keeping a record. I am an analyst by profession, and documentation is a reflex. I wrote down dates and times and durations. The crying occurred on average 4 times per week, always in that 224 window, always for between 3 and 11 minutes. It never escalated to screaming. It was quiet and rhythmic, and it had a quality I can only describe as exhausted. The sound of someone who has been crying for a very long time and has no expectation of being heard. I began to sleep badly. I want to be honest about that because it is relevant to what follows, and because a reasonable person would want to factor in sleep deprivation when evaluating the reliability of a witness. I was not sleeping well. I was also not eating regularly. I was drinking more than I should have been. and I was in the middle of a divorce that was becoming adversarial in ways I had not anticipated. My mental state was not pristine. I acknowledge all of that. It does not explain what I found in the storage unit. Each apartment in the building came with a small cage-style storage unit in the basement. I had used mine only once to store 2 boxes of books I didn't have shelf space for, and I had not been back down there in over a month. I went on a Saturday afternoon in early December because I needed a specific book and could not remember which box it was in. The basement was poorly lit and smelled of concrete and old water, and the storage units were arranged in 2 long rows with a narrow corridor between them. My unit was the 4th on the left. When I got there, I found the cage door standing open. I was certain I had locked it. I stood there in the corridor for a moment, trying to decide what I believed, and then I went inside and looked at the boxes. They had not been moved. Nothing was missing. But in the corner of the cage, on the concrete floor, there was a small pile of children's drawings. Crayon on white paper, the kind of drawings that end up on refrigerators. There were 11 of them. Each one showed the same thing, a tall rectangular shape that I understood, after looking at several of them, to be a building with many small windows. And in one of the windows, in each drawing, there was a figure. The figure was always in the same window. I counted the floors. 7 up from the bottom. I counted the windows from the left. 3 across. That was my window. The window where I worked at night. I brought the drawings upstairs. I spread them on my kitchen table and I sat with them for a long time. The crayon was not fresh. The paper was yellowed at the edges and soft in a way that suggested age. These were not recent. I thought about calling someone, Gerald the Super, or the police. And I tried to construct the conversation in my mind and couldn't find a version of it that didn't sound unhinged. I put the drawings in a drawer and I did not sleep that night. What I am about to describe happened on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of December, 6 weeks after I moved in. I had been awake since the crying started at 2:40 and had not gone back to sleep. At 3:55, I heard a sound in the corridor outside my apartment door. It was not a footstep exactly. It was more of a weight shifting, a slow and deliberate redistribution of pressure. The sound a person makes when they have been standing still for a long time and finally move. I went to the door. I stood on my side of it without touching it for almost a minute. Then I looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty. I know it was empty because I stood there looking through that peephole for a long time. Long enough that my eye began to ache, and I saw nothing. What I felt, standing there, is harder to describe. It was not fear in any ordinary sense. It was the particular sensation of being observed without being able to locate the source. The feeling of existing inside someone else's attention. I unchained the door and opened it. The corridor was empty, lit by its usual fluorescent half-light. Absolutely still. But on the floor, directly in front of my door, there was a single crayon. Red, the same red used in the drawings. I stood in the doorway and looked at it and did not pick it up. I closed the door and put the chain back on and sat down on the floor of my entrance and stayed there until the light under the door changed from the flat yellow of the corridor to the gray of morning coming through the window at the end of the hall. I moved out 12 days later. I did not tell the building management why. I forfeited my deposit without argument. I did not go back to the storage unit. I left the drawings in the kitchen drawer, and I left the wooden chair, and I left 11 months on my lease. The last thing I did before I left was check the peephole one more time from the inside. The corridor was empty. It was always empty when I looked. That is the thing I find myself returning to, more than the crying, more than the drawings, more than the crayon on the floor. Not what I saw. What I understood by the end was looking back. I worked the night shift at the county records office for 11 years. And in that time, I developed the kind of relationship with silence that most people never have to. The building was old, built in 1934, according to the cornerstone near the front entrance, and it settled and creaked through the winter months in ways that stopped bothering me after the first year. I was alone from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. 6 days a week, responsible for filing, cataloging, and maintaining access to roughly 4 decades of municipal documents, property transfers, death certificates, court records, birth registrations, zoning disputes. Nobody visited at night. Nobody called. I drank bad coffee from a machine in the hallway, and I listened to the radiators knock, and I did my work. That was the arrangement, and I was content with it. The first time I noticed something wrong was in March, on a Tuesday. I was pulling a folder from the archive room on the 3rd floor, a tax dispute from 1987 that a lawyer had requested for the following morning, when I found a file that had been misfiled. This was not unusual in itself. The previous cataloger had been careless, and I spent a significant portion of my first 2 years correcting her errors. What was unusual was the file itself. It was a death certificate, standard form, county issued, but the name on it was mine. My full name spelled correctly, middle initial included. The date of death, listed, was March 14th. I was holding it on March 12th. I stood there in the archive room under the fluorescent light, and I read it 3 times. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head. The certifying physician's signature was illegible. The address listed was my current address, the apartment I had moved into 8 months prior, which meant the document could not have been filed before that. I photographed it with my phone, replaced it in the folder, and spent the rest of the shift trying to find any record of when it had been entered into the system. The database showed no entry. As far as the digital record was concerned, that folder did not contain that document. I told myself it was a prank. The building had other staff during the day, clerks, administrators. A rotating cast of temp workers, and I had a tense relationship with one of the day supervisors, a man named Greer, who had twice tried to have my shift eliminated for budget reasons. I considered the possibility that he or someone acting on his behalf had placed it there to unsettle me, perhaps to provoke some reaction that could be used against me. The theory was thin, but it was the only one I had that did not require me to accept something I was not prepared to accept. I went home on March 13th, slept poorly, and returned for my shift on the night of March 13th, moving into March 14th, with the specific awareness that this was the date on the certificate. Nothing happened. The shift passed like any other. By 4 in the morning, I was almost embarrassed by how alert I had been, how carefully I had listened to every sound in the building. I finished my coffee, completed my filing, and left at 6. Outside, the morning was gray and cold and entirely ordinary. I walked to my car, drove home, and decided the matter was finished. I did not go back to check the folder until the following week. When I did, the death certificate was gone. In its place was a standard property transfer document that belonged there, that I recognized from my own cataloging work 2 years earlier. I pulled the entire drawer and went through every folder. There was nothing. I checked my phone and found the photograph I had taken. It was there, clear and legible, my name and the date and the cause of death, so I knew I had not imagined it. I forwarded the photograph to my personal email and left the archive room, and did not go back that night. Over the following 6 weeks, I found 4 more documents. The second was a hospital intake form in my name, undated, listing a head injury as the reason for admission. It was tucked inside a folder of building permits from the 1990s, in a different section of the archive entirely. The third was a witness statement, the kind used in accident investigations, that described a man matching my physical description, being struck by a falling object in a parking structure. though no location was named and the witness signature was a scrawl I could not read. The fourth was a handwritten note on plain paper, not an official document at all. That said only, "He keeps finding them too early." The fifth was another death certificate, identical to the first in every detail except the date, which had been changed to May 2nd. I brought photographs of all of them to a lawyer, a friend from college, and asked him what he thought. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. He asked if I had shown them to the police. I said I hadn't, because I wasn't sure what crime had been committed. He said that was a fair point. He told me the documents looked genuine. The forms were correct. The paper stock appeared right in the photographs. The formatting matched what he had seen in similar county documents. He said this was either an elaborate psychological harassment campaign, which would require someone with access to official forms and significant motivation, or it was something he didn't have a framework for. He said it carefully, the way people say things when they want to be honest without sounding foolish. I appreciated that. I requested a review of the building's access logs for the overnight hours. Greer approved the request with what I thought was unusual speed, and the logs showed nothing. No keycard entries after my arrival. No motion sensor triggers in the archive rooms on the nights in question. No anomalies of any kind. The security camera in the third-floor hallway had a recurring malfunction, a black frame that appeared for between 1 and 4 minutes at irregular intervals throughout every night that the building's maintenance log indicated had been reported, and never fixed since the previous October. I asked how long the malfunction had been occurring. The technician checked and said it had started on the night of March 11th, one day before. I found the first document. I want to be precise about what I did and did not believe at this point. I did not believe in ghosts. I did not believe in prophecy. I had been a practical person my entire adult life, a person who filled out forms for a living, a person who found meaning in the correct alphabetization of a drawer. What I believed was that someone was doing this deliberately, that the access logs and the security footage had been manipulated, and that the purpose was to frighten me. I believed this because the alternative that the documents were appearing on their own, that something in that building was generating paperwork about my death and placing it, where I would find it, was not something a person could believe and continue functioning. So I continued functioning. I went to work. I drank my bad coffee. I listened to the radiators. The note I found on April 29th was the last one. It was not in a folder. It was on my desk when I arrived for my shift, held flat by my coffee mug, which I had left in the building the previous night. It was written in the same hand as the earlier note, on the same plain paper. It said, asterisk, the date is not a warning. It is a record. Asterisk, I stood at my desk and read it 4 times, and then I sat down very carefully in my chair. I am not a person who panics. I have prided myself on that for most of my life. I sat in my chair and I breathed, and I thought with great deliberateness about what I was going to do. I decided I would finish my shift because leaving early would feel like a concession to whatever this was. I decided I would go to the police in the morning with all of the photographs and the full account. I decided I would request a transfer to another facility, or, if that was denied, resign. These were all reasonable decisions made by a reasonable person who was afraid. I finished my shift. I left the building at 6 on the morning of April 30th. I drove home and I slept, and I woke up and I was alive on May 1st. I reported everything to the police, who took a statement and did not call me back. I submitted a transfer request, which was approved after 2 weeks. I have not returned to that building. The documents, all 5, plus the 2 notes, are photographed and stored in 3 separate places. I have told this story to 4 people, including my lawyer, and none of them have offered an explanation I find satisfactory. Today is not May 2nd. I want to note that clearly. I am writing this on a day that is not May 2nd, And I intend to write it again on May 3rd, and again on every day after that. What I found in that building has not happened. What I found in that building may have been a hoax, an elaborate and pointless one, carried out by a person I cannot identify for a reason I cannot determine. I have chosen to believe this. I have chosen to believe it with the same deliberate effort a person uses to believe anything that is necessary for them to continue. I have kept my phone charged. I have stayed away from parking structures. I check the locks on my apartment door twice each night, which I did not do before, and which I acknowledge is not a rational response to the specific nature of what frightened me, but which I do nonetheless, because a person needs to do something. I check the locks, and I go to sleep, and I wake up, and every morning I wake up, I note the date, and I note that it is not the date on the certificate, and for a few minutes, that is enough. I found the body on a Tuesday, which is the kind of detail that stays with you, not because it matters, but because your brain fixes itself to something ordinary when everything else stops making sense. Tuesday, garbage collection day. I remember hearing the trucks 2 streets over while I stood in my neighbor's kitchen and looked at what was left of him. His name was Gerald Marsh. He was 63 years old, retired, widowed, and he had been dead for approximately 4 days before. I let myself in through the back door he always left unlocked for me in case of emergencies. I had a key to my own house, a mortgage, a daughter in college, and a completely rational explanation for every decision I made in the weeks that followed. That is what I told myself then. I am less certain now. Gerald and I were not close in the way people mean when they use that word about neighbors. We shared a fence, a driveway boundary, and a habit of standing in our respective yards on summer evenings with beers we didn't finish. His wife Eleanor had died 4 years before I moved in, and he spoke about her the way people speak about weather, as something that had shaped the landscape permanently and was no longer worth explaining. He watched my daughter grow up through the gaps in that fence. He called her kiddo until she was 19, and she never once complained about it. When I noticed his lights had been on for 3 nights straight without any movement behind the windows, I told myself he had gone to visit his brother in Tucson and forgotten to set a timer. When his mail started piling up, I told myself the same thing with slightly less conviction. When I smelled something faint and wrong on the 4th evening while watering the roses along our shared fence line, I stopped telling myself anything and went inside to put on shoes. The back door opened the way it always did, a slight lift of the handle to clear the warped frame, a push, the familiar exhale of air-conditioned interior. The smell was worse inside, but not overwhelming, not the way I had expected from television and vague cultural memory. It was dense and sweet and biological in a way that made me think of fruit rather than death, which struck me as obscene even in the moment. Gerald was in his kitchen chair. He had been eating cereal. The bowl was still in front of him, the milk long since evaporated to a gray film. His head had fallen forward onto his chest at an angle that looked uncomfortable in the way only the living can be uncomfortable, and I understood immediately and completely that he was gone. I did not scream. I did not run. I stood in the doorway for what I later estimated was about 2 minutes, watching him the way you watch something you cannot yet classify. And then I took out my phone and called 911. The paramedics were professional and efficient. The police officer who came was young and wrote things down without visible emotion. They asked me standard questions, and I gave them standard answers, and within 2 hours, the house was empty again, and Gerald was gone, and I went home and washed my hands 4 times without knowing why. That should have been the end of it. That is the part I return to now, the clean and reasonable conclusion that was right there, available to me, the one I failed to take. 3 days after they removed Gerald's body, I began hearing movement in his house. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing I have left that feels honest. It was not dramatic. It was not the sound of footsteps or voices or anything that announces itself as significant. It was the sound of ordinary habitation, a chair shifted, a drawer opened and closed. The creak of weight on floorboards, in the particular rhythm of someone moving from one room to another with a destination in mind. I heard it first on a Thursday evening while I was doing dishes. The houses were close enough that sound carried through walls and windows. And I had heard Gerald's television, his phone calls, his occasional bouts of insomnia that manifested as late-night shuffling for 2 years before he died. The sound I was hearing was indistinguishable from those sounds, which was the problem. I told myself it was the settling of a house adjusting to the absence of its climate control being managed. I told myself it was animals, raccoons perhaps, finding a way in through the garage. I was good at this, the telling of myself things. I had been doing it since my husband left and my daughter went to school, and I became the sole resident of a house that had been designed for more people than currently occupied it. On the 5th night after Gerald's death, I stood at my bedroom window and watched his house for 40 minutes. His house was dark. His house was locked, I knew, because I had watched the police officer lock it and pocket the key. There was nothing behind those windows. I went to bed. At 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of his back door opening, the specific sound of it, that lift of the handle and push. The sound I had made myself 3 days before when I went to find him. I lay in my bed for a long time without moving. I am a 51-year-old woman with no history of mental illness, no medication that causes auditory hallucinations, no trauma beyond the ordinary and manageable kind. I heard what I heard. I got up, went to the window, and saw nothing. His backyard was empty. The door, visible from my angle, appeared closed. I went back to bed and did not sleep until dawn came and made the darkness negotiable. I called Gerald's brother in Tucson the next morning. His name was Frank, and I had met him twice at neighborhood gatherings, and he was a softer, shorter version of Gerald, with the same habit of holding his beer without drinking it. Frank told me he was planning to come out in a few weeks to handle the estate. He asked if I would keep an eye on the place. I said I would. I did not tell him about the sounds. I did not tell him about the door. I kept my eye on the place for 11 days, and on the 9th day, I watched a light move through the interior of Gerald's house at 3 in the morning. Not a lamp switching on, not an overhead fixture, but the narrow traveling beam of a flashlight or a phone moving from the back of the house toward the front. I watched it reach the front window and stop. I was standing at my bedroom window in the dark, and the light was perhaps 20 feet from me across the narrow gap between our houses. And I had the absolute and physical certainty that whoever held that light knew I was watching. The light did not move for 4 minutes. I counted. Then it went out. I called the police. They came, checked the house, found no signs of entry, no signs of occupation, nothing disturbed. The officer who came was not the same young man from before. This one was older and had the face of someone who has stopped finding human behavior surprising. He was patient with me in a way that made me feel like a category rather than a person. After he left, I sat in my kitchen until morning and thought about Gerald eating cereal alone at his kitchen table. The milk going gray, the lights on, nobody knowing. I thought about how close we had been. Separated by a fence and 2 years of beer-holding conversations. And how completely I had failed to notice he needed something. Not help, specifically. Just notice. Frank arrived on a Friday, 2 weeks after Gerald's death. I brought him a casserole because I didn't know what else to do with the guilt that had settled in me like sediment. He was gracious and tired, and we stood in Gerald's kitchen, which had been cleaned by a service Frank had hired over the phone. And we talked about logistics and memories in the careful way people do when they are both avoiding the center of something. I almost didn't tell him. I had constructed a reasonable architecture of explanations that made the lights and sounds endure into the products of stress and grief and the overactive pattern recognition of a brain that had found a body and not yet finished processing it. Then Frank said, quietly, while looking at the empty chair where Gerald had died, that he had found the front door unlocked when he arrived that morning. He said he assumed the police had left it that way. He looked at me when he said it. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for a moment that was longer than it should have been. I helped Frank carry boxes to his rental car that afternoon, and we did not discuss it again. He sold the house 6 months later to a young couple with a retriever and visible plans for the kitchen. I have watched them move through their evenings behind those windows with the particular ease of people who have no history with a place and therefore no reason to wonder about it. I still hear things sometimes. Not often. Not always at night. The sound of a drawer, a floorboard, a door handled in a specific way by someone who knew its particular resistance. I have not called the police again. I have not told anyone until now what I heard and saw in those weeks. Gerald was a man who ate cereal alone and died without anyone noticing for 4 days. That is the true horror of this story. Everything else is just the house remembering him.